To finance projects, firms can raise capital in broadly two ways: debt and equity. In this short video, we will discuss the cost of equity and how it can be measured with the help of the capital asset pricing model or CAPM. We will look at some of the key assumptions of the CAPM, like the mean variance framework, the importance of diversification and the role of the marginal investor, along with the limitations of the model. We will also try to understand why the CAPM persists as one of the most commonly used risk return models in finance, despite its unrealistic assumptions and several limitations. The capital asset pricing model, or CAPM, developed in the 1960s, is a model which can be used to determine a theoretically appropriate required rate of return on a financial asset. It is most commonly applied to calculate the cost of equity, which is a return that investors expect to invest in the equity of a firm. So, we now move the discussion to understanding expected returns of equity investors. There are a few features of the CAPM which are important to understand. First, the CAPM uses variance to measure risk, variance of actual returns around an expected return. This is called the mean variance framework. Of course, this approach has limitations, which we will see later. Second, it says that an investor should be rewarded for only that risk which cannot be diversified away. As an example, if you invest all your money in a risky stock and say, I want compensation for it in the form of a very high return, that's not going to happen. Why? Because the investor can reduce his or her risk by diversifying, that is, investing in more stocks and financial instruments. Third, it measures the non-diversifiable risk with a measure called beta, which is standardized around 1. What this means is a stock which has an average risk, its beta will be 1. So stocks with a beta higher than 1 obviously are those which have above average risk. And then it translates the beta into expected return using this equation, which we will see in detail later. Finally, there are several other risk return models in finance. Most of them are complex, but the CAPM works as well as others in most cases. Let us try to understand the mean variance framework which the CAPM uses to measure risk. Investors who buy a financial asset expect to make a return over time. The actual return that they make over this holding period may be very different from the expected return, and this is where risk comes in. Consider an investor with a 1-year time horizon buying a 1-year government bond with a 5% expected return. Let us assume that the government does not default and the investor receives 5% return at the end of the year. Thus, the actual return in this case is equal to the expected return. The probability distribution of the return for such an investment is shown in figure 3.1. This is a riskless investment. As opposed to this, consider investing in the stock of a company. The investor does her research on the company and the stock and estimates that the expected return for this year is about 20%. The actual return on this stock will almost certainly be either higher or lower than 20%. Figure 3.2 shows the return distribution for this investment. In addition to expected return, the investor now has to care about 3 more factors. First, the deviation of the actual return from the expected return, which is captured by the variance or standard deviation. A larger variance means more deviation from the expected return. Second, the bias towards positive or negative returns is captured by the skewness of the distribution. This distribution above is positively skewed, as there is a greater likelihood of positive returns as compared to negative returns. Third, the shape of the tails of the distribution is measured by kurtosis. Fatter tails lead to higher kurtosis. In investment terms, this captures the tendency of the price of this investment to jump in either direction. In the special case of the normal distribution, returns are symmetric and investors do not have to worry about skewness and kurtosis. In that case, it can be argued that investments can be measured only on 2 dimensions. One is the expected return, which comprises the reward, and 2, the variance in anticipated returns, which comprises the risk on the investment. Figure 3.3 illustrates the return distributions on 2 investments with symmetric returns. In this scenario, an investor faced with a choice between 2 investments with the same expected return but different standard deviations would always pick the one with the lower standard deviation. In closing, We should note that in practice, mean and variance are almost always estimated using past returns rather than future returns. The implicit assumption is that past return distributions are good indicators of future return distributions. This may not be true when the asset's characteristics change significantly over time. When this assumption is violated, the historical estimates may not be a good measure of risk. There are several limitations of the mean variance framework. Since it measures risk quantitatively using just one number, it does not accurately capture our complicated relationship with risk. Behavioral finance has presented three aspects of risk which differ from the mean variance view. First, prospect theory proposed by Kahneman and Tversky says that human beings are affected more negatively by a loss than they are by an equivalent gain. Thus, human beings are loss averse, not risk averse. There has been evidence for this behavior, and Daniel Kahneman, of course, won the Nobel Prize in Economics for this work in 2002. Second, human beings seem to perceive less risk in familiar investments than unfamiliar investments. And third, it is not always possible to quantify emotional factors like investor mood, which affects risk perception. Till the 1950s, the notion was that stocks with higher variance have higher risk and hence we should get a higher return from them. Along came Harry Markowitz in 1950s, who was a PhD student at the time, and observed that if you take some high variance stocks and add them to a portfolio of stocks, they are not that risky. So let us look at the different types of risk and see how diversification helps to reduce risk. More importantly, which risks can and cannot be reduced with diversification. Risk, as we have defined so far, arises from the deviation of actual returns from expected returns. This deviation can occur for many number of reasons. On the one end of the spectrum, there are those risks that are specific to the investment, called firm-specific risks. And on the other end are those that apply across most or all investments, which are called market risks. Across this spectrum, there are broadly 5 types of risk in any project or investment. The first is project specific risk. An individual project may have higher or lower cash flows than expected, either because the firm misestimated the cash flows for that project or because of factors specific to that project. When firms take a large number of similar projects, it can be argued that much of this risk should be diversified away in the normal course of business. The second is competitive risk, due to which earnings and cash flows on a project are affected either positively or negatively by the actions of competitors. In most cases, this component of risk will affect more than one project and is therefore more difficult to diversify away in the normal course of business by a firm. Third is the industry specific risk, which is typically driven by factors like technology disruption and regulations. Fourth, firms which generate revenues or incur costs outside their home country face international risk associated with currencies and political environments. Finally, macroeconomic factors like inflation and interest rates affect the entire market, all companies and all projects. It is important to note that firms can diversify across projects, sectors, and countries to eliminate or reduce all types of risk except market risk. This logic lies at the heart of the CAPM and all other risk return models in finance, when they say that investors should only be compensated for market risk because they can eliminate or reduce all other risks by diversifying across stocks. In spite of the advantages of diversifying, we know that most investors do not diversify. So, is this a problem for risk return models like CAPM? Don't they assume that all investors are diversified? The answer is of course no. The CAPM assumes that only the marginal investor in an investment is diversified. But who is the marginal investor? Any investor who is most likely to be the next buyer or seller on the next trade and is able to influence the price. Generally speaking, the marginal investor should fulfill two criteria. One, she should own a lot of stock so that she can influence the price. And second, she should trade on a regular basis. Due to this definition, we can imagine that the largest investor may not always be the marginal investor. Think about Mukesh Ambani at Reliance or Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook. They do own a lot of stock, but don't necessarily trade a lot due to restrictions on insider trading. As we discuss, the risk return models like CAPM assume that only the marginal investor is well diversified. But how do we find out who the marginal investor is in a particular company? Here are some guidelines based on how much stock is owned by institutional investors like mutual funds and how much stock is held by insiders like founders and senior management. This data is readily available for listed companies even for free on websites like Yahoo Finance. The first two cases are simple. If the percentage of stock held by institutions is high, then the marginal investor is some kind of institutional investor, and it is safe to assume that these investors are well diversified. Think about large mutual funds. These investors are usually well diversified. If institutions hold a low share of the stock, however, and a significant percentage is held by insiders, it could be tough to tell who the marginal investor is. We need to look at what percentage of listed shares are owned by the institutions or what percentage of trading is done by institutions. If that share is high, we can once again assume that marginal investors are institutions. If we look at the last two cases, it is possible that the marginal investor is a wealthy individual or small investors with restricted diversification. In those cases, the CAPM needs an adjustment since the diversification assumption may not be valid. So, if diversification reduces risk, how many stocks should an investor hold? 10, 20, 50, 100? The CAPM assumes that there are no transaction costs and that all assets can be traded. If that is the case, investors should end up buying all the assets in the market. This portfolio is called the market portfolio. In the CAPM world, all investors hold a diversified market portfolio, not individual stocks. Think about how portfolios of different investors would look like in this CAPM world. Investors who have very different risk preferences. The investor with no risk appetite will of course put all her money in safe assets like treasury bills or government bonds. An investor with more risk appetite will put a part of her money in T-bills and the other part in the market portfolio, so on and so forth. In the CAPM world, how would you measure the risk of a stock? Not using variance of the individual stock, but by counting the risk it adds to the market portfolio. How do we measure that? It depends on how the stock moves compared to the overall market. Statistically, this is called as covariance. To get a standardized measure of risk, we divide this covariance with the variance of the overall market so that a beta of 1 reflects the risk of an average risky stock. If we assume betas measure risk, then expected return on that investment would be the risk-free rate plus beta times the market premium. The market risk premium is simply the excess expected return on the market portfolio over and above the risk-free rate. That brings us to the final point. Does this model work well? Here we run into several problems. First, as is obvious from the preceding discussion, the model makes unrealistic assumptions. Second, it is difficult to accurately estimate the parameters of this model. The fact is, as seen from evidence, this model does not work very well in practice. How do we know that? For that, we need to look at what should be the case if the model is right. There should be a linear relationship between returns and betas, which means that stocks with higher betas are supposed to have higher risk and supposed to give higher returns. This does not tend to happen in practice. In the 1990s, Fama French tested what percentage of the variation in returns is explained by betas. For a model that works perfectly, 100% of the variation in returns of any stock should be explained by its beta. Fama and French of course found this percentage to be less than 10% and of course proposed two more variables which seem to explain returns better. If the CAPM makes so many unrealistic assumptions and does not work well in practice, why does it still persist as one of the most popular risk return models in finance? The answer is simple. It takes a model to beat a model. The alternative models proposed over the last 50 years don't do much better than the CAPM in predicting future returns. Alternative models like the arbitrage pricing model and multi-factor models do a much better job when it comes to explaining past returns but are not very effective in predicting future returns. Specifically, alternative models are more complex and need more information than the CAPM. And despite using this more information, the estimated expected returns are not that different to justify the extra effort. This discussion only goes to show how difficult it is to predict stock returns accurately, and that risk return models are just that. They are models which make assumptions and try to provide estimates. Due to this ambiguity, the role of people aspects, negotiation, judgment, and instincts remains an important part of investing and finance.